Okay, I want to talk a little bit about furlough and reentry. And I'm using the analogy here of a space mission. If you know anything about missions to outer space, you know that the two most crucial and vulnerable periods of that mission are liftoff and reentry. And so I want to talk to you about that because this is something that many missionaries aren't prepared for. They don't expect it. And so it's important that we recognize that it is indeed a reality. What is a furlough? Well, some call it home assignment. And again, furlough kind of comes from the military scenario. Guys would come back for a brief reprieve from their service in the military, and they would call that a furlough. And missionaries kind of picked up on that idea as well. Some prefer home assignment because it deals with the with the fact that you're still ministering even though you're off the field. It's not a 6-month or a 1-year vacation, as some have very wrongfully concluded that it is. And the reason I emphasize that it's not a vacation is because you've become accustomed to living in another culture, and all of a sudden you're thrust back into your own culture. And somebody living back here might say, well, they're back home. They're used to this, but they've changed. The missionary is not the same as he or she was when leaving for the field, and coming back and living in the home country is not exactly as it used to be. It's a time of ministry to supporters. A lot of your time is spent traveling, visiting churches. Now, my in-laws, when they were missionaries, had 50 supporting churches, which means, in a 1-year furlough of 52 weeks, they're out just about every weekend of the year. Maybe on occasion they could be in one church on a Sunday morning, another church on a Sunday night, and another church maybe on a Wednesday night. But it was a lot of traveling. And we had only 15 supporting churches and about as many supporters individually. But churches were 15, and if we did have individual supporters, most of them were members of churches that supported us, so we could see them at the same time we were visiting the church. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of traveling, and if you have small children, that can be quite a challenging experience. It is a time of sharing with family and friends as well, time to reacquaint with parents and relatives and people you haven't seen for a long time. It's a time of refreshment and renewal. There should be a time of vacation, a time to get away from the work. Just like you need that when you're on the field, you also need it when you're home on furlough. So a missionary on furlough should never feel guilty for taking a week or two or even a month just to relax and get away, because that's very, very important in being refreshed and renewed. Sometimes it's a time of fundraising. If there has been a change in the economy on the field where you are and the currency, the exchange rate has changed, it may be necessary to do a little bit of fundraising. If that's the case, then no problem. But again, that's something that can tire a missionary out. After he spends time on deputation or pre-field, raising all this money, thinking, good, I got that out of the way, and now all of a sudden he's back home and he has to raise some more. It can be very, very draining. It also could be a time of continuing education. Now, today with online courses, a lot of missionaries can do online studies, wherever they are in the world. But the fact of the matter is, when you're busy in ministry, it's hard to take time for something like that, even if the technology is available to do it. Furlough is a more reasonable time when missionaries are away from their normal work and can focus more on that sort of thing. And so continuing education is often a highlight and a priority for missionaries who are home on furlough, if they indeed feel that that is something that will enhance their ministry experience. How long should a furlough last? Well, that's another good question. It used to be that a year was considered a typical furlough and 4 years a typical term. There are actually 4 entities that contribute to making that decision. The sending church should have a role in that decision. The mission agency, may have a policy on that. Some agencies actually will say that a missionary should not plan to take a furlough for at least the first 2 years or the first 4 years or whatever the missionary decides. And part of that is because a lengthier stay during that first term of service will help you to embrace and adjust to the culture that you're serving, where you're serving. The missionary does have something to say about that. And also the field. If you're working with colleagues, I taught in a Bible school in Brazil. And so we missionaries coordinated our furloughs so that none of us, we wouldn't all be gone from the school at the same time. We were working with nationals. About half of the faculty was missionaries, the other half was nationals, but we tried to be very careful not to take all of our furloughs together and leave a big hole in the ministry of the seminary there. And so that is also an important consideration. The trend today seems to be more frequent furloughs for shorter periods of time. Missionaries are more apt to be gone for a couple of years and come home for 6 months than to be gone for 4 years and be home for a year. Again, that varies a lot, and it depends somewhat on the cost of travel. And so it just, again, that's something that needs to be thought through very carefully so that when the time comes for furlough, everybody is on the same page. Now, there are reentry symptoms that you need to watch out for when you're planning to come back. For example, there's this thing called reverse culture shock. Now, you may remember the little diagram we looked at before when we talked about culture shock, but we also made mention of the fact that following a time away in another country, you can actually experience reverse culture shock. You come home expecting things to be the way they were when you left, and you find out they've changed. We came back on furlough and heard this word cholesterol. We thought, what in the world is that? They didn't use that in Brazil. It didn't take long to figure out what cholesterol was. I'm just saying that there are terms, there are ideas, there are political moves that have been made. Pastors often switch churches. You come home to a supporting church and whose pastor you've never met before. He's never met you. People leave your church. People pass away. Things change. And so if missionaries are not ready for that, they can find that culture shock back in their own country is just as hard, if not harder than it was dealing with a new culture when they first went to the field. And so that the right side of this chart kind of shows you how culture shock can be repeated when you're back in your home country again. The same, kinds of phases that you go through when you go to a foreign field, you can also find yourself experiencing back home again. All right? And so it's important to keep that in mind. Remember that your homeland has changed. A lot of things may be different about your country. When you think about the moral revolution that's going on right now, the LGBTQ plus revolution, the whole idea of gender identity and transgenderism. I mean, in the last 2 years alone, so much has changed that it's just, I mean, if a missionary has been gone for 4 years, let's say since the year 2018 and comes back in 2022, the year that I'm recording this, just think about all the changes that have taken place. The election of a very new and different president and cabinet, and all that's involved in the moral revolution. And if you come home to that for the first time, wow. You say, well, we have internet today. People can learn about that online. Well, to an extent, you can. But remember that the internet is limited. Even though you may learn about those things, coming back and living within that context is very different. It involves a whole lot more than just reading about it online. And you have changed. You may not recognize that. You may not understand some of the changes that you yourself have gone through by adjusting to another culture, but the fact is you have changed. And coming back to your own culture and feeling the things that you feel and the changes that have taken place could be a wake-up call for you and saying, wow, I didn't realize how different I am from what I was. Some of the attitudes I had before I left, I've completely changed since going to the field. That may be good, it may be bad. I'm just saying that changes do take place. Your family and friends have changed. They've gone on and made new friends. Their lives, they have to continue living, and some of them may have moved. And, your best friend when you left may not be your best friend any longer. That person has a new best friend, and your new best friend may be on the field. So all that has changed. Your church has changed. Some people have left. Your church may have changed its worship style since you left. It may have built a new building. And as I mentioned, your pastor may have resigned. Okay? And the people who were in leadership when you were there may no longer be in leadership. So all these things can present challenges and make you feel a little bit kind of lost, like a man without a country. In fact, when it comes to MKs, some people call them third culture kids because they're neither fully American nor fully whatever country they're living in. And so they've kind of become a breed of their own, and they call them third culture kids. One person jokingly said that the only place that an MK is truly at home is on the flight between the two countries. Bit of an exaggeration, but it makes the point. Look, avoid being in high gear from start to finish. Workaholism is not a virtue, it's a vice. You may think that when you come home and you're working hard and you're burning the midnight oil and wow, you're impressing your supporters by how dedicated you are. They may look at you and say, you need to slow down. You need to relax. You're not being a responsible steward. And they would be right in saying so. And then be careful about negativism towards your own country. Sometimes when missionaries first go to the field, they're really negative about the field that, the new country, the host country where they're living, because they're comparing it to their own country. But oftentimes by the end of that first term of service, especially if it's a full term of like 4 years, they may actually switch their thinking so that by the time they come home, they say, wow, I thought that, Brazil, in my case, was wrong about this, but now I see things differently. And I may come home and become critical about the United States. And sometimes missionaries do that. They come home and they become very critical about their host country. It's materialistic. They're spiritually cold, and they don't sing and worship like the people in the country where we're serving. And you can become very, very negative about your own country. Be careful about that. Because the fact is that there is no country in the world where all believers are doing everything right. We all have our flaws. We all have areas where we need to improve. Okay? And so these are just some thoughts that you need to keep in mind as you're adjusting to a new culture and then coming back and adjusting to being home again. But if you'll keep those things in mind, they'll help you to be prepared, because the worst way to come back on furlough is to be unprepared for things that may happen that you never imagined could take place, in terms of your attitude or your expectations in coming home and re-entering the country from which you departed 4 years ago. So just a lot of good common sense things. And just keep this in mind also. There are some things that are going to happen that you cannot be prepared for. That's true both in going to the field and in coming back. You cannot be prepared for everything all the time. You do the best you can, and then you say, Lord, help me with the areas that I can't control and for the surprises that I could not have anticipated. And if you'll do that, God will see you through and enable you not only to weather those storms, but to grow and be strong through them.